Cities all over the world have expanded rapidly over the last century, and while that's brought prosperity, it's also left some communities behind and forgotten. In some countries, residents have even resorted to settling in cemeteries where thousands of people live alongside the dead. Experts say if nothing is done, these kinds of communities will become more common. Joining us for a closer look at this is Professor of Urban Planning at Columbia University, Elliot Sclar. Good to have you with us on Your Morning. Can you give us some examples of cemetery communities around the world and how they came to be, how they operate?
Yes. The two that have been very prominent in the news is the one in Cairo, which is just close to the center city, and there's one in Lima, which is very similar. These cemeteries became places where people live because since around 1950, the world has undergone a massive process of urbanization. By the middle of this century, there will be 7 billion people living in cities, and that's when with a population of around 10 billion. So we've gone from a world where only 30% of the world was urban in 1950. 100 years later, in 2050, it will be reversed. It'll be 70% of them will be living in urban places. So what's been happening is cities have been expanding out, and as they've expanded out, the cemeteries, which were originally at the edge of cities, now become in the middle of these big urban agglomerations, and people move to cities for opportunities, and opportunities are very uneven. And what begins to happen is the cemeteries all of a sudden become a really good place to live. They're quiet, and they were relatively safe compared to other places people could live.
What I found fascinating is, you know, much like any kind of an industry, let's say there's a factory or an office hub, because so many of these people were working in the cemeteries as either masons or as groundskeepers, they started to live where they worked. And that's what caused this sort of cemetery city to grow.
Well, that, and then newcomers would arrive and would be looking for places to be. So you have two effects. The jobs within the cemetery become hereditary jobs. They get passed down from father to son, grave diggers, tending to graves and so on. But what also begins to happen is other people begin to move in, and crime moves in. So a number of things begin to happen.
All right, given the developed world has already found solutions to most of the problems that the developing world is dealing with now, why is it that the developing world is repeating these mistakes by following an older blueprint of, you know, where to settle people and how to supply their needs?
Yeah, the problem is the sad part of the story is that if you look at the history of New York, the history of London, the history of other great cities, what you find is we had all those problems at the turn of the 20th century as those cities industrialized and populations moved. So these are solvable problems. We do know how to solve them. The problem is now is that we have to begin to figure out how to solve them in the cities in the world that are growing. I'll give you a statistic that's worth keeping. Roughly, somewhere about half. Over 3 billion people in the world, half of the world's population lives on less than $2.50 a day, U.S. And so the problems in that sense, the problem is very large. But on the positive side, about 10 years ago, I did some work for the UN. We had a task force looking at the lives of slum dwellers around the world, and we figured out for around $2 trillion. You could, in fact, solve the problem. $2 trillion may sound like a lot of money, but that's less than half the cost of what the U.S. is paying for the Iraqi invasion. So it's not that the resources don't exist in the world, it's that our institutions have not caught up with the rapid pace of urbanization, and so people are living in cemeteries, people living in cardboard boxes, people living in tin huts, people living without safe drinking water, children mortality rates. There are places I've been where the under 5 mortality rate was as high as 20%. You'd walk into these communities and all these children would greet you, and you'd look at them and you would think 1 out of every 5 of them isn't going to be there by the age of 5. While the problems are very real and very large, they are solvable, and we could do it if we could get our act together.
Mr. Sclar, startling statistics. Thank you for bringing this issue to light for us today. Thanks for joining us.